Hi, I'm Todd Malcolm, head coach at NoLimitsTriathlon.com, and today I'm with Louise Taylor, who is a physiotherapist, triathlete, runner extraordinaire, working at the Downtown Sports Clinic here in Calgary. And today we're going to talk about stretching. We're going to show you some examples about stretching, why you should stretch, and a little bit more about stretching as well. I'm not quite sure what we're going to talk about. It's just going to come on out. So Louise, thanks for joining us today. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great today. And you just came from a nice workout, so you're warmed up for stretching?
Yeah, so we just did a brick class, which is a 90-minute bike ride followed by a 10K run, so I need some stretching for sure. And so one question a lot of people ask me is, should I stretch? And it's a question I like to have people stretch after runs for sure, for about 10 to 15 minutes. But do you think everyone should stretch?
The shorter answer to that is no, but the longer answer is most people, and everyone has a different demand for stretching. So essentially stretching, we're trying to look at mobility of joints and flexibility of our soft tissues, like our muscles and even our tendons. So depending on what issues you're having, your age can influence things, your sport that you're doing. If you spend a lot of time sitting in bad postures, you'll probably have to stretch to try to lengthen things out. Particularly sports like running, the repetition of running and swimming will tighten up muscles just inherently, or a lot of weight training. Those type of things will tend to make our muscles tighter. So depending on activities, that could be something to consider if you should be stretching a lot. And another major thing is just keeping the joints mobile so they function as well as possible. So it could be a performance issue to make sure your body's moving as well as it can. It could be an injury rehabilitative issue, trying to make the muscles function as well as they can so you can return to activity. And it can also just be a wellness thing too. So there's a meditative component to stretching, as in yoga, that just makes people feel good.
Well, I know that last year I broke my arm. I broke it up top here, and I had to stretch every day to get that flexibility back. And it was amazing that, you know, I lost that mobility. So for me, I had to focus on stretching every day to get that back. Because if I didn't do that, I think my range of motion would have been limited. So now I can be able to swim again, which I'm super happy with. But yeah, I think you need to stretch for a lot of different reasons. So what are we going to do today?
Today we're going to, we'll have this little chat just talking a bit about stretching so people can understand what we're doing, why we should do it, who shouldn't do it, how often you should do it, just some of the sort of rules and regulations of stretching, and then we'll do some stretches so we can focus mostly on the shoulder and the hip. And I picked those primarily because those are three-dimensional muscles. They need to move in all planes, flexion, extension, sideways, rotations, and when there's problems with those joints particularly, it creates a lot of issues. So lack of shoulder mobility, particularly for a swimmer, is going to affect technique and just ability to perform. Tight shoulders tend to lead to more impingement or pressing on the tendons, so you're more likely to get injured. So there's flexibility that the swimmer needs in the triathlete world. And then running, hip mobility is very important for our function of our back and as well as our knees. So if our hips are very stiff, we often transmit forces up into our spine, which can cause problems, or down into our knees. So often knees and back problems actually come from hip problems. So we're going to focus on those sort of three-planar motions of the shoulder and the hip.
So you mentioned some rules and regulations. So can you go over some rules and regulations about stretching?
Well, I have to start off by saying there's been a lot of controversy over stretching over the last decade or so, because there's been a lot of research into stretching for these very reasons that we're talking about. Who should stretch? Why should you stretch? What does it do? Should we all be doing it? And there's been some findings that show a lot of stretching, particularly before activity, so aggressive, really pushing stretching before activities like plyometric activities like springing, jumping, basketball, sprinting, has actually been shown to increase an injury risk. So there's certainly some times and some performances that we don't really want to work excessively on our flexibility unless we're routinely doing it. Within muscles, there are receptors called muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs. That's not that important, but what they do is transmit messages to the body to tell you when things getting tight, when the tissue's getting threatened, or when it's too long, another place that they're getting threatened, and that causes the body to tighten and protect. So if you have a normal state and then you try to change it dramatically, your body's going to respond accordingly. So if you're used to being at a certain tightness and then suddenly you change everything, the nerve messages up through your spinal cord to your brain are going to be altered, and then you try to do something at a high performance level and your body's going to be confused. So that can actually lead to injury.
Right.
So there's certain situations where you don't want to be doing excessive stretching, but before an activity that requires a lot of mobility, like swimming, doing a bit of warm-up through your shoulders and having good shoulder mobility would be important. So I guess for some of the rules and regulations, when probably any time. It doesn't just have to be before an activity or after an activity. Research seems to point more at doing it after the activity is better for those very reasons we just talked about. So having a stretch routine after activity kind of helps unwind the body. If you just push really hard, whether it's strength training, loading it, or interval training, or just long intensive training, or long slow steady training, your muscles will be tight just because of that work. So loosening them up is just part of recovery. So you don't then go sit for dinner or sit on the couch for a couple hours. Things kind of stiffen up and tighten, and that's how your body starts to recover. So if you've actually lengthened them out before you do those things, you'll have a better recovery. But it could also be totally separate. You could do it in the evening. You could have an evening routine very separate from your workouts. People with very busy schedules that don't have time to do their stretching for 15-20 minutes after the exercise, you can still do it later. So it's not an excuse to say, oh, I don't have time. It can be done anytime. And then it can fall into that sort of relaxation, parasympathetic, slow your system down before you sleep type of approach. So stretching can be really nice then.
Nice.
Another rule about the whole warm-up before you do stretching, it's nice to be warmed up because warmer tissues are more pliable, but not essential because you'll warm up a bit just as you stretch. So that's why after workout is nice, because you're warm, unless it's -20 outside, and then maybe you want to go inside, warm up, because stretching when you're really cold, it just takes longer to get warm. It's not going to be as effective. It's going to take longer to get the same effect. And then there's how long should you hold a stretch. So there's a lot of variability in the research when they look at stretching. Studies will sometimes be a 30-second stretch or a 2-minute stretch, or there's no consistency on studying the same amount of stretching. So it's hard.
I do 15 seconds.
15 seconds?
I do 15 seconds, yeah. So I'm going to tell you my routine, what I get people to do, and you tell me if I'm out to lunch, right? And so what I get people to do when they're swimming, biking, or running, a lot of times my athletes, they don't have time. They come to the pool, and they're usually late. Half of them are late. I don't get too upset. So they don't have time to stretch. But what I recommend them to do is once they hop in the pool, they have to warm up. I say you can't start swimming fast. You have to go slow. So I think that's the way to stretching the body as well. I mean, you're not actually doing a stretch, but you're just warming your body up. Same thing on the bike. Instead of just hammering on the bike, you got to warm up. So we might do a spin-up drill, some one-leggers, or just an easy spin and build up. So I do that on the run. On the bike. And on the run, same thing. I generally don't get people to stretch before the run. I get them to stretch after the run. But when you're doing a run workout, I make sure you got to do a warm-up. And the warm-up should be, in my opinion, I like 10 minutes. And I find that the older you get, you might need 15 minutes to warm up. And so that just means you can start off with a walk and gradually build up. So that's what I like to do for a warm-up. One of my favorite stretches that I like to do, the routine, is I do a strength workout using TRX. Are you familiar with TRX?
I am.
So at the end of the TRX workout I do, there's some really good stretches that I like. I just find it really stretches me out, and it's a great ending to the workout. So let me go back to my stretching routine. Yeah, so after the run, I do probably 5 or 6 stretches, and about 15 seconds, say on each side. So 15 seconds on one leg, 15 seconds on the other leg, and I'll try to go through it 3 times. So that's not that long, right, when you think about it. But for me, 15 seconds. But let's ask the expert. What do you think? Is 15 seconds good?
The research seems to support that it's cumulative stretching. So if you did 15 seconds 3 times, you're getting close to about a minute. And that seems to be kind of a magic time frame, somewhere between 30 to 60 seconds of stretching. So whether you do 1 for 60 seconds or 3 or 4 for 15 seconds, you're going to get the effect. Okay. So if you're doing them fairly consecutively, you're going to get a good result with that. And then just speaking to your warm-up part that you were talking about, so warming up, think of that as it's getting your body ready for activity. So doing a lot of static stretching, which usually means holding things for these longer time frames, 60 seconds or longer, is not really going to prepare you for your activity, because your activity is dynamic. So we talk about dynamic stretching, which is using movement. So whether it's doing arm swinging motions before swimming, or doing leg swinging exercises, or just working through the range of motion that you'll be using for the activity. So that would fall into stretching as well, but more dynamic. That would definitely make sense to do that before an activity, where the more static stretching, the slower stretching, would fall afterwards.
So going back to what I talked about in the beginning is I broke my arm last year, and I broke it here, and I had to get my flexibility back. Now, why did I have to get my flexibility back? Wouldn't it be good just for me just to say, okay, my arm's broken, now it's healed after 8 weeks, let me just start going exercising? What would go wrong if I did that?
Okay, well, you probably noticed after your injury how stiff the arm was. You didn't have your full range of motion.
No way.
And some people think, well, I'm just going to start using my arm, it'll all just come back, I'll get in the pool, start using it. But what's happened over that time frame, 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes 3 months of immobilization or protection phases, is tissues have shortened. The actual capsule of your shoulder joint, the muscles, everything's shortened and tightened. So to actually lengthen that out, that's where you need your sustained stretching. That's where you found the benefit of a daily stretching routine, because every day, probably every day after you did your routine, it was a bit better. You kind of come back to the next day, oh, it's stiff again. But overdoing that for a few weeks, you slowly recover your mobility. And that's very important to get the range of motion back, not just for ease of swimming, because obviously if you can't move your arm very well, you're not going to have a very good technique. You're not going to go very fast.
Like
you're going to sink. You're going to go in circles.
It wasn't pretty.
Yeah.
It wasn't pretty.
So there's that sort of performance aspect, but there's also the health of the joints. For all our joints, there's a particular range of motion that they should have according to our architecture and build. And if we have less, it's stressful for the joints. Joints require movement to get lubrication of joint surfaces. So if we're not actually getting that full range, it's not healthy for our joint. So over time, 10, 15 years later, after injury like yours, that can predispose to more arthritic changes. So not getting your motion back is really significant.
So doing an Ironman after breaking my arm was a good thing for me to do?
Will probably help mobilize you. So you could definitely say getting it moving was good.
Yeah, absolutely was. It was a good...
How was your swim time in that race?
You know what? It was pretty good. I did under maybe 105 for an Ironman swim.
Right. And was your movement pretty good by the time you came back? Would you say 80%, 90%?
I would say probably 85. It would. Every time I would take a stroke, it would click, and that was kind of a bit of annoying.
Right.
More of a mental thing, but I could still swim.
If you're getting 85 to 90% of your motion, you're probably not going to notice it too much in your activity. But if it's much less, you would have noticed more. But there's still that long-term impact on the joint. So getting the mobility back, definitely healthy for our joints.
Cool. So we just had a brief talk with Dave Proctor, right? So he's a massage therapist here, and he's one of Canada's best ultra runners, right? He's probably the national champion or something.
He was last year.
Yeah, right. So we just grabbed him, and I said, how are you stretching? And what did he say about stretching?
Dave said, oh, I don't stretch.
He doesn't stretch?
He said, I don't stretch. But then when we questioned him a little bit more, he said, oh, but I do stretch because it makes me feel good. Yeah. So we did have a stretching routine that he does, but it's not a big focus of him for running. And a lot of runners would say that. I think you would even say that yourself. You don't focus a lot on stretching for running.
No.
And there's a reason why. Because runners need the spring and elasticity of our tissues to help propel ourselves, to help our economy of motion, to help our performance. So if you're really loose, mobile, kind of loosey-goosey body type, tends not to be the most efficient runner, because you're expending energy, just kind of absorbing it into the ground and then just having to expel it again to get yourself moving forward. Right. So our springy tissues are helpful. So a lot of runners, not sprinters, because they definitely need a little bit more mobility, but any middle distance, long distance runner sort of likes to have that stiffness in the tissue because it just helps them run better.
Cool.
But there's kind of a tipping point there, where if you let things get too tight, then it can start affecting performance and lead to injury.
Right.
So there's going to be a point there where people do start to feel like they need to stretch. And usually most runners stretch only because they've had an injury history, not because they feel like they should.
Okay, let me just add to that. You said there's a tipping point when your body gets too tight. How do you know? I mean, it's probably a magic question, right? How do you know that your body is too tight and you got to start stretching? If you're not stretching, I suggest doing a little bit of stretching for sure. But you know what? If you get too tight, next thing you know, boom, you're doing something to your leg. So, do you have any cues or things that we can think about when we should really focus on it?
There's certainly benchmarks of mobility that if you don't have it, you're going to be at a little more injury risk. So when people have a lot of trouble reaching the floor, touching their toes, which a lot of runners can't do.
Yeah, I mean, that's me.
But if you spend 5 or 10 minutes stretching, you can probably get there.
That's right.
If you can never get anywhere close, that's a problem. Because that's going to affect how you function, how your pelvis moves, how your back moves. So and people out there probably know if they're that person. And there could be other reasons besides the muscle tightness leading to that inability to reach the toes. It could be something about a sciatic nerve pathway, or so just nerve tension, which doesn't respond well to stretching. So if you're someone that stretches all the time, you're like, I never get any better, there could be some other issue at hand there that needs to be investigated. So other things to be pushing you towards stretching would probably be increased training. Just doing more than you're used to, because anything the body's not used to doing will tend to put more stress on the tissue.
Sure.
And you'll usually wake up with that morning tightness feeling, and so your warm-up part is important to just get your body going before you get into activity. So any big changes in activity would be a good guideline. And then there's also the stretching or the collagen elasticity continuum in people. So we were probably both fairly tight people. We were discussing this a little bit beforehand in terms of our muscles, but some people are very floppy. And they just probably don't need to stretch as much. They may never need to stretch. So when you ask me the question, should everybody stretch? There are certainly people that shouldn't stretch. They probably need to do way more stability than they do flexibility. But for most of us, you got to meet your benchmarks of does your body move well. So if your hip doesn't move very well, you probably need to focus on hip. If your shoulder doesn't move well, you need to focus on that. Those swivel joints definitely need to move well. So and that's where having someone look at you, or you may even notice in a yoga class, everyone can do something and you can't. Maybe it's something you should be working on.
Right. Cool. Well, thanks for the chat. What we're going to do now is we're going to go look at some stretches. We're going to go through some sample exercises you guys can do at home. Is there anything else you want to cover before we move over to the exercises? Louise is going to quickly go through her notes, see if there's anything else that can be covered. This commercial break is brought to you by the Downtown Sports Clinic. It's your body. We can help you make the most of it.
That's good.